how your country or your town can leave the fiat money warmongers behind and jump into the future with a peaceful, loving Bitcoin, hyper Bitcoinization.
In this interview, Max Keiser talked about why he continues to be one of the biggest Bitcoin bulls on the planet. He said that Bitcoin is going to replace fiat money as we know it. He also talked about what the US government is doing to advance the adoption of cryptos. He also talked about exactly when we could expect Bitcoin to explode in the coming months and all the catalysts behind the upcoming rally. Also, I'd just like to remind you that we're giving away $100 to a random subscriber at the end of this month. To take part in it, all you have to do is subscribe to our channel, turn on post notifications, like this video, and leave a comment in the comments section below. Good luck. Now, let's look at his interview.
Well, there's two factors that drive adoption. One is continued collapse of the banking world and the way the inflating all the fiat money is driving a need for Bitcoin. So in countries where you see a lot of inflation, a lot of money printing, like Central America and South America, Bitcoin is already making huge inroads. And then in countries where banks are precarious or central banks are failing, like in Lebanon or a couple of others, the Bitcoin awareness and adoption is moving forward. So just the collapse of the status quo is driving adoption into Bitcoin. And then the other factor that drives adoption is really the way that Bitcoin almost is a way to hack its way into human nature by tickling the greed gene. You know, when your neighbor starts getting wealthy with Bitcoin, you want to find out more about Bitcoin. And the price, the number go up technology that's built into the protocol means a lot of people become envious of their neighbors and friends and family be getting rich on Bitcoin, and they start to check out Bitcoin. So the FOMO aspect to it, clearly you see that in corporate America with Michael Saylor jumping in, and now you go to the corporations looking at his balance sheet and seeing what's happening over there and saying, hey, this is something we got to get into. We can't let this guy get super rich, and we want to jump in too. So it's FOMO plus bank failure equal Bitcoin adoption. How soon does that take place? It's because it's a technology, it's a messaging technology, and it's going through what you could call exponential growth. We are shortly going to be at that moment when you'll see what we saw in the internet days back in 1997, where it went from 150 million users and people in the New York Times were writing about maybe the internet's a fad and it'll disappear, to suddenly becoming ubiquitous. So I think similarly with Bitcoin, you've got roughly 150, 100, 200 million users. We're entering a phase now where you'll suddenly see 1 to 2 billion users will be talked about as the current market for Bitcoin, and driven again by those two major pillars of adoption: bank and fiat failure plus FOMO. I think that's where the community comes in, because the Bitcoin maximalist community is a hardcore community, and they're constantly pushing self-sovereignty. And as people go on their Bitcoin journey and they realize the difference between this option that you can have for self-custody, they will gravitate toward it. So it's I think that's just I think that's where the community is crucial, in that it defines more precisely what the Bitcoin life is. People who live the Bitcoin life. So when we're in El Salvador, we try to live the Bitcoin life. What does this mean? That means self-sovereignty. That means living in a big country with Bitcoin as legal tender. It means altruism. It means not more loving and caring, less violence and hatred. So that's where the community comes in. The community is great at defining what that means, and so I think that's just part of the journey that people take. Ultimately, they end up in a place of self-sovereignty. Right. Going back to the 90s, Stefan, during when I had an internet company back in the 90s, people thought AOL was the internet. They thought, oh, that's the internet, AOL. There's a lot of people who think Facebook is the internet. At the moment, people are not completely aware of what is the underlying Bitcoin protocol and what are the things that sit on top of the protocol. But so I think, again, we're at that moment of transition where people suddenly realize, hey, you know what, there's this underlying technology, et cetera, and it does a lot of different things. So again, using the 90s as a proxy for where we are now, I think that's kind of the transition we're making. People who would, their first experience would be through Chiba Wallet would make that confusing point, but similarly what they did in the 90s, and then we transitioned to a greater awareness and a deeper understanding, as we saw with the internet. So with El Zonte Capital, which is our VC fund, and if anyone has any questions about it, they can do an email to hello at El Zonte Capital, and you'll take it from there. But if you have any questions about it, so the fund is going to be focused on hyper Bitcoinization. It's going to be focused on new entrepreneurs in El Salvador. Stacy's working with Jimmy Song, and they've identified dozens and dozens of potential new Bitcoin developers and programmers that they're going to be training up with the Jimmy Song's boot camp, Python Bitcoin developing boot camp. We've got now 50, 60 people in the first week, and we're able to pass the basic Python test and look eligible to be ready to go. So that's another exciting part of the country that was really an undiscovered source of talent. I don't think anyone realized that there was so much engineering talent in El Salvador, and yet that's what we're finding is that there's a lot of youth there that is completely technologically literate and ready to embrace this technology, and that's a lot of really good jobs and changing the country fundamentally. So that's right. So we'll be fostering that as much as we can at El Zonte Capital. And so again, the theme is hyper Bitcoinization and Bitcoin maximalization. And but it won't be exclusively El Salvador. So we will be looking at the region and really around the world as well, where you see people mimicking El Salvador. So El Zonte is the template that other countries and other cities will be mimicking, right? So they are the leader, and it's the El Zonte formula, if you will. You know, how your country or your town can leave the fiat money warmongers behind and jump into the future with a peaceful, loving Bitcoin, hyper Bitcoinization. We've seen it all over Africa where with the cell phone, mobile phones adoption, people just leapfrog ahead away from the copper wires and telephony that the legacy systems were used to. And that brought on a lot of entrepreneurialism. And what was missing was Bitcoin. So, I mean, Africa is really a place that is benefiting incredibly by Bitcoin, by having this pristine, almost virtually perfect money that can cross all over the continent. Because just doing business in Africa from one country to another that could be 10 miles away or a mile away, it required an enormous amount of regulatory hoops to go through on the banking system, and all that's being obviated by Bitcoin. And to your point, absolutely, we have a leapfrogging going on. That's why agile, entrepreneurial countries like El Salvador, other countries all over Africa, now in Central America, are better positioned to capitalize on Bitcoin than, let's say, the United States or Great Britain, that are really completely entrenched in the old model, and they're not agile. I would not say when it comes to Bitcoin, they see it as a threat. The IMF and the World Bank and the Federal Reserve Bank and politicians, for the most part in the U.S., see Bitcoin as a threat, and it is a threat to the old way of doing business. There are fortunately some politicians in the U.S. like Cynthia Lummis and others who are now embracing Bitcoin. Ted Cruz is another. They see it as a vote winner, a vote getter. And people are becoming single issue voters where they'll vote for the Bitcoin candidate. So that's in the U.S. Unlike other countries, you have states' rights, and the states are very, very powerful. They've been very powerful in, for example, changes to marijuana laws in the United States. It all started on the state level. Now it's going to the federal level. It probably will happen in the Bitcoin arena as well. There'll be a couple of states that will start to lead the Bitcoin charge. Could be Texas, could be Wyoming, and then that'll trickle up to the federal level as well. So the states in America, there's a tremendous balance of power that goes on there that's unlike anything in Europe. Europe tends to be very authoritarian in the way that it operates, and really around the world you find that. Only in the States do you have this kind of dynamism. The people come to Bitcoin who they are. You come to it at who you are. And if you're a technologist like Michael Saylor, that's how you come to the party. If you're a professor of monetary history like Saifedean Ammous, that's how you come to the party. And you write the Bitcoin Standard, and it's an instant classic. If you're a politician, you're going to come to Bitcoin as a politician. You're not going to come to it in any other way. That's all you know. And as long as you are talking about Bitcoin and buying Bitcoin, that's all we need. That's all we care about. I've often said that the politicians in Washington that are now talking about Bitcoin is something of a fifth column for the Bitcoin revolution. They're inside, they're behind the walls, they're talking to other politicians. It's not needed, it's not required, but it doesn't hurt. Just like having Wall Street get into Bitcoin doesn't hurt. If you have trading derivatives on Bitcoin, doesn't hurt in the way that it does in the gold market, for example. People make that comparison often, but there's some key differences. So it doesn't hurt. Anybody who's buying Bitcoin, asking about Bitcoin, talking about Bitcoin is adding to the momentum of Bitcoin, moving it forward toward a global Bitcoin standard, hyper Bitcoinization, and Bitcoin maximalism. Bitcoin maximalism, again, is something that if your journey on Bitcoin ultimately leads toward Bitcoin maximalism, the more you learn, the more you know about it, the more you enter into what's called a Bitcoin maximalist or a toxic Bitcoin maximalist. So, and that's the road. The road narrows. The further down the road you get, the narrower the road is. It's a bit of a biblical reference, but there you have it. So, but because Bitcoin represents Stefan, there was I think it was either the Time magazine or The Economist. They ran a cover story 7 years ago now, and about Bitcoin, and they call it the truth machine. And that was very prescient, and that was very forward thinking. It's very true. The absolute truth is going to create absolute outcomes. And in the case of perfect money, it means less war, less hate, and all these other benefits, and less carbon emissions.